Into the fire. The shrill sound of the alarm shattered the stillness of the fire station, piercing through the early morning quiet like a battle cry. Captain John Carter was already halfway into his turnout gear before his mind registered the address flashing on the screen. His heart stilled for a fraction of a second before pounding back to life, his pulse hammering in his ears. No, not that house. His hands clenched into fists, then unclenched as he grabbed his helmet and dashed toward the fire engine. The other firefighters fell into their well-rehearsed routine, but John's mind was spiraling. The address belonged to the Parkers. Mark Parker, his best friend, his brother in everything but blood. And his family lived in that house. The fire truck roared through the empty streets, sirens splitting the darkness apart as they raced toward the blaze. John's grip tightened around the rail, his knuckles white. He had been a firefighter for nearly 15 years, had seen flames consume homes, seen families shattered by the devastation left behind. But this was different. This was personal. As they rounded the corner onto Oakwood Lane, the night was alive with fire. The Parker residence stood engulfed in roaring orange flames, stretching hungrily toward the sky. Thick, black smoke billowed into the night, choking out the stars. The acrid scent of burning wood and insulation clung to the air, stinging John's throat even before he reached for his mask. Thompson residence, full engagement. One of his men shouted into the radio. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed his axe and ran. Neighbors stood outside in their nightclothes, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow. Some had their hands clapped over their mouths in horror. Others shouted helplessly as embers shot through the air like falling stars. John's boots hit the pavement hard as he sprinted toward the house. "Mark," he bellowed, though he knew there was little chance of an answer. His gut twisted as he registered the state of the inferno. The structure was barely holding. His radio crackled. "Cap, we gotta be careful. This thing's ready to come down." John ignored the warning. He had to get inside. A scream. No, crying. A child. His heart lurched as he pivoted toward the sound, scanning the windows through the dense smoke. Then he saw them. 3 small faces pressed against the upstairs window, their silhouettes barely visible through the thick haze. Michael, Sam, and Eli. John didn't think. He moved. His body acted on instinct, pushing through the front door as flames clawed at the walls. The heat was unbearable, even through his protective gear. Each breath felt like swallowing fire, but he forced himself forward. "Michael, Sam, Eli," he roared. A muffled sob answered him. His mind weird, calculating. The stairs were still standing, but for how long? Flames licked at the banister, devouring the wood. No time. He surged forward, bounding up 2 steps at a time. The house groaned around him, the fire consuming everything in its path. Heat and smoke pressed against him from every direction. Suffocating, relentless. His eyes burned as he reached the hallway and spotted the closet door cracked open. John yanked it open and found them. 3 small bodies huddled together, trembling. Michael, the oldest at 12, was curled around his younger brothers, shielding them as best he could. Sam, 9, had his arms wrapped around Eli, who was sobbing into his shoulder. "Uncle John," Michael gasped, his voice barely a whisper through the smoke. John didn't waste a second. "I've got you," he said, his voice fierce with determination. He scooped up Eli first, cradling the boy against his chest as he turned back toward the stairs. The heat intensified with each step as the fire raged around them. The moment he burst through the front door, hands reached for Eli, pulling him to safety. But John was already moving back inside. Sam was next. The boy clung to him as John navigated the unstable stairs, dodging falling debris and smoldering embers. By the time he made it outside again, his lungs were screaming for relief. One more. John wheeled back around and charged back into the house. Michael stood in the closet doorway, his face streaked with soot and sweat, his young body trembling. "Come on, kid," John urged. Michael hesitated. His eyes darted toward the master bedroom, then back at John. "My parents," he choked out. John's heart twisted painfully. "I'll find them," he promised. "But you have to go now." Michael swallowed hard, then took his hand. John practically flew down the stairs, knowing the house had only minutes left before it collapsed entirely. As they stumbled onto the front lawn, a loud crack split the air, followed by a deafening roar as the second floor caved in. John turned, shielding Michael as debris crashed down. His heart dropped to his stomach. Mark and Sarah. They were gone. He turned toward the ambulance where Eli and Sam were already wrapped in blankets, shivering. Michael stood beside him, staring straight ahead, his face too serious for someone so young. "Uncle John." Sam's voice was small, broken. John's throat tightened as he crouched down, pulling the boys close. "They're not coming out, are they?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. John exhaled shakily, his hands gripping their small shoulders. He wanted to lie, to tell them everything would be okay. But he had never lied to Mark, and he wouldn't lie to his sons. "No," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Eli buried his face in John's chest and sobbed. Sam wiped at his eyes furiously, as if denying the tears would change reality. Michael simply stood there, silent and still. John held them, his own tears slipping silently down his face as the flames behind them burned the last remnants of the Parker home to ash. And in that moment, as the weight of 3 shattered lives settled onto his shoulders, John Carter made a promise. These boys would not be alone. They had lost their parents, but they hadn't lost him. A new home, a new life. The morning of the funeral was cold, the sky a dull gray that mirrored the heavy weight in John Carter's chest. He stood at the cemetery, the 3 boys beside him, their small hands tucked into the sleeves of 2 big jackets. The black suit he wore felt suffocating, but it wasn't nearly as tight as the lump in his throat. Rows of chairs stretched before them, filled with familiar faces. Neighbors, friends, firefighters from his station, people who had known Mark and Sarah, people who had loved them. The soft murmurs of conversation wove through the crisp autumn air, broken only by the occasional sniffle or the rustling of leaves beneath shifting feet. Michael, the oldest at 12, stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tight that John could see the muscles twitching. Sam, at 9, kept his eyes down, scuffing his dress shoes against the dirt. Eli, the youngest at 6, clung to John's hand, as if it were the only thing keeping him standing. John tightened his grip. They needed him. He had been to more funerals than he could count. Too many fallen firefighters, too many tragedies. But this one was different. This one was personal. As the pastor began to speak, John barely heard the words. His eyes were on the boys, watching how they absorbed the reality of their loss in different ways. Michael, silent, stiff, like he had forced himself to become the man of the family overnight. Sam, angry, his hands clenched into fists, his body vibrating with barely contained emotion. Eli, fragile, small, his quiet sobs sending tremors through John's chest. When the service ended, the crowd began to disperse, offering condolences in hushed tones. John stood still, the boys huddled close as if they were afraid to move. That's when the whispers started. Those poor boys. What's going to happen to them? I heard they don't have any other family. A firefighter raising 3 black boys alone. That's not going to be easy. Is he even going to keep them? John felt a surge of anger at that last one. Of course, he was going to keep them. Did they really think he would walk away? That he would let these kids be sent off to some foster home, separated, left to navigate their pain alone? Not a chance. He turned to face the boys, his expression softening as he crouched down. Come on, guys. Let's go home. Eli sniffled, rubbing his sleeve across his nose. Sam blinked hard, like he was trying to hold back more tears. Michael hesitated. Home, he echoed, his voice rough. John nodded, keeping his voice steady. Yeah, my home. Our home. The words seemed to hit Michael like a physical force. His shoulders slumped, his posture loosening just slightly. It was the first time he had relaxed at all that day. Eli's little hand squeezed his tighter. Sam swallowed hard, but he nodded. They followed him to the truck in silence, stepping into a new life without looking back. Adjusting to change, the house was too quiet. For 3 years, John had lived alone, the silence something he had come to expect. But now, with 3 kids under his roof, the silence was heavy. It wasn't the comforting kind. It was the kind that came before the storm. The boys didn't speak much in the first few days. They were polite, careful, but distant. Their rooms, once guest rooms, now transformed into makeshift bedrooms, were barely touched. They didn't bring much from the old house, just a few bags of clothes and a handful of belongings the fire hadn't destroyed. At night, John would hear them shifting in their beds, whispering to each other in the dark. And every night, at some point, Eli would creep down the hallway and slip into his room, standing at the doorway, his tiny frame barely visible in the dim light. "Can't sleep?" John would ask softly. Eli would shake his head, so John would scoot over, lifting the blanket. "All right, come on." Eli would crawl into bed beside him, his small hands gripping the fabric of John's shirt, clinging to it like a lifeline. Some nights, Sam would follow. Other nights, Michael would stay in his room, but John could hear him awake, shifting restlessly, lost in his own thoughts. They were adjusting. Slowly. John did his best to keep their routines as normal as possible. Mornings were spent making sure they got to school on time. Afternoons were filled with homework and quiet dinners. Evenings were the hardest, when the weight of grief settled in. But the real struggle wasn't just the grief. It was the town. Whispers in the wind. John had lived in this town his whole life. He knew how people thought, how they talked. And they talked a lot about him. It started small, glances at the grocery store, lingering stares when he picked the boys up from school. Then it turned into comments. "How's it going with the boys, John?" asked with an undertone of doubt. "You sure this is the right thing for them?" As if loving them wasn't enough. "People are just concerned, because they're different." That one made his blood boil the most. Different, because they were black and he was white. Because they had lost everything, and he had stepped in to help. Because he had chosen to love them. At the town's annual fall festival, the whispers turned to open conversation. John took the boys, hoping a day of normalcy would help them settle in. But as they walked through the crowd, he felt the stares. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the craft booth, pursed her lips when they approached. "Quite a change you've made in your life," she said stiffly. John smiled, his voice even. "Just doing what's right." She nodded, but the judgment was clear in her eyes. Further down the festival, he overheard a hushed conversation. Can a single white man really raise 3 black boys? They should be with someone who understands their culture. It's not natural. John's hands clenched into fists. Before he could say anything, he felt a small hand slip into his. Eli. The boy had heard too. John crouched beside him, lowering his voice. "You okay, buddy?" Eli hesitated. Then he whispered, "Are we your real family?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. John swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "You are my family, Eli. No matter what anyone says." The boy nodded but stayed close for the rest of the day. That night, after the boys were asleep, John sat on the back porch, a cold beer in his hand and a heavy weight in his chest. He had known this wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he wondered if love would be enough. Breaking the silence. Days turned into weeks, and the boys slowly started opening up. Michael, once quiet and distant, started helping John around the house, fixing things, working in the yard, shadowing him like an apprentice. Sam became fascinated with science, spending hours reading in the living room, sometimes even asking John to quiz him. Eli found old watercolors in the attic, belongings of John's late wife, Claire. Instead of asking for permission, he simply started painting. One afternoon, John found him at the kitchen table, lost in his work. "What are you making?" Eli glanced up, biting his lip before turning the painting toward John. It was their house, but not as it was. The colors were brighter, warmer. There were flowers in the yard that didn't exist, sunlight streaming in ways it never had. And there were 4 figures standing together on the porch. John, Michael, Sam, Eli. A family. John's throat tightened. He reached out, brushing a hand over Eli's hair. "It's beautiful, kid." Eli hesitated. Then he whispered, "Can we put it in the living room?" John smiled. "Yeah, buddy, right where everyone can see." And in that moment he knew. Love was enough, and he would prove it to the world. Standing tall, the days turned into weeks. The weeks stretched into months. Winter crept into town, dusting the streets with frost and filling the air with the scent of burning wood from the chimneys. Christmas lights flickered in windows, and carolers braved the cold to bring warmth through song. Inside John Carter's house, the warmth was of a different kind. It was the kind found in shared meals, in the soft hum of the boys' voices at the dinner table, in the sound of Michael and Sam bickering over homework, in Eli's quiet murmurs as he painted by the fireplace. It was the kind of warmth that meant home. But home wasn't just about warmth. It was about proving, to the world, to the town, to themselves, that they belonged together. And that, John realized, was the battle they still had to fight. The first challenge. Michael was the first to notice it. It started small, longer stares at the grocery store, conversations that cut off when John and the boys walked by. Then it escalated. The first real test came when Michael was at school. It happened in the hallway, just outside the cafeteria. Michael had been walking with his tray when he heard it. Low, hushed voices that were meant to be overheard. I bet his real parents wouldn't have wanted him with a white guy. Maybe Carter just felt guilty. White savior complex, you know. They're not a real family. Michael stopped. He turned slowly, his jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the tray. The 3 boys standing behind him smirked. One of them, a taller kid with an expensive-looking jacket, crossed his arms. "You got something to say?" Michael asked, his voice even but sharp. The taller boy laughed. "Nah, man, we were just talking. But hey, must be nice getting all that firefighter money now, huh? Hope he keeps you long enough to cash in." Michael saw red. His tray clattered to the ground as he lunged, grabbing the boy by the collar and shoving him against the lockers. Gasps rippled through the hallway. Teachers shouted. Michael didn't throw a punch, but he wanted to. He wanted to hit something, to make them understand that John wasn't some temporary fix, that they were a real family, that no amount of sneering could change that. But the teachers pulled him away before he could do anything more. He was sent to the principal's office, and John was called. Facing the consequences, Michael sat in the principal's office, arms crossed over his chest, eyes burning with frustration. He knew what was coming. The lecture, the disappointment, the suspension. The door opened, and John walked in. His face was unreadable as he sat beside Michael. The principal, Mrs. Evans, cleared her throat. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence, Mr. Carter." John nodded. "I understand. But what exactly happened?" Mrs. Evans shifted. Michael shoved another student. "We don't tolerate that kind of behavior." John turned to Michael, his expression expectant. "Is that true?" Michael swallowed, then nodded. "Yeah." "Why?" Michael hesitated, then muttered, "They were talking about you. About us." Something flickered in John's eyes, but he kept his voice level. "What did they say?" Michael hesitated. "That we aren't real. That you're just taking care of us until you don't want to anymore." John's jaw tightened. He turned back to Mrs. Evans. "What's going to happen to the other boys?" Mrs. Evans shifted uncomfortably. There's no evidence they instigated anything. But Michael, they did instigate it, John interrupted. They'd made it personal. The room fell silent. Mrs. Evans sighed. I can't excuse violence, Mr. Carter. Michael will have in-school suspension for 3 days. If there's another incident, we'll have to consider further disciplinary action. John nodded but didn't argue. He turned to Michael. Let's go. The car ride home was quiet. Michael expected anger. He expected disappointment. But when they pulled into the driveway and John finally spoke, his voice was calm. You know, your dad and I used to get into fights too. Michael blinked, caught off guard. What? John smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Mark and I, we didn't always have it easy. We had our own bullies. People who didn't like the idea of us being best friends because he was black and I was white. Michael frowned. So what did you do? John exhaled slowly. We fought. A few times. But we also learned that the best way to prove people wrong isn't with your fists. He looked at Michael, his expression firm but kind. You don't have to prove that we're real, son. We know we're real. That's what matters. Michael swallowed, nodding. And for the first time since the funeral, John saw something shift in him. The weight on his shoulders didn't disappear, but it got a little lighter. Eli's dream. While Michael was learning how to navigate the world's judgment, Eli was finding his own way to express himself. It started with a sketch, then a painting, then an idea. One night, John found Eli sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by unfinished canvases. Eli, he asked, stepping inside, what are you working on? Eli looked up, his eyes bright. I want to do a big painting. Something that shows our family. John crouched beside him. Yeah, what's it gonna look like? Eli's hands moved excitedly as he spoke. I want to paint a tree. A really big one. And the roots are gonna be 2 colors. One for my birth parents and one for you. But they're all connected, growing together. John's throat tightened. He reached out, squeezing Eli's shoulder. That sounds beautiful, buddy. Eli grinned, his face glowing. Do you think people will like it? John smiled. I think people will love it. So Eli started painting. And he didn't stop. He worked on it every day after school, mixing colors, layering strokes, bringing the image in his mind to life. The town still whispered, still questioned. But Eli had found a way to answer them without words. He let his art speak for itself, and when the painting was done, it wasn't just a tree. It was home. Sam's decision. Sam had always been the quiet one, the thinker, the observer. But one day, John found him sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of medical books. What's all this? John asked. Sam looked up, his face serious. I think I want to be a doctor. John raised an eyebrow. Yeah. Sam nodded. I want to help people, like you do, but in my own way. John's chest swelled with pride. Then that's exactly what you'll do. Sam smiled. And just like that, each of the boys had found something to hold on to. Michael had his determination. Eli had his art. Sam had his dream. And John had them. Together, they would weather whatever storms came next. Because they weren't just a family. They were unstoppable. Weathering the storm, winter deepened, coating the town in a thick blanket of snow. The frost-covered rooftops and icy roads gave everything a picturesque beauty. But inside John Carter's home, the season was proving to be one of the most challenging yet. It had been almost a year since the fire that took Mark and Sarah's lives. A year since John had made a silent vow to protect and raise their boys as his own. But even the strongest promises faced tests. Michael, Sam, and Eli were growing, changing, finding their own paths. And with that, new challenges emerged. The town's whispers hadn't completely faded, and neither had the boys' struggles in adjusting to a life so different from the one they had before. And then the storm came. The first real fight. It started on a Saturday evening. John had just finished a shift at the fire station, exhausted but eager to spend time with the boys. He expected to come home to the usual sounds: Eli humming while painting, Sam reading at the kitchen table, Michael messing around with something in the garage. Instead, he walked into a full-blown shouting match. Michael and Sam were standing in the middle of the living room, faces red with anger, their voices rising with every word. Eli sat on the couch, eyes wide and teary, his small hands gripping a pillow. "What the hell is going on?" John demanded, stepping between them. Michael turned, his chest heaving. "He doesn't get it." Sam's fists were clenched at his sides. "You don't get it either. You think just because you're older, you always know what's right." John looked between them. "Somebody explain." "Now." Sam exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. "Michael's talking about dropping out of school after graduation." John's heart stopped. "What?" Michael's jaw tightened. "It's not dropping out. I'm just not going to college. I don't need it. And I don't want it. I have my own plans." Sam scoffed. "Oh yeah? And what about everything, Dad?" He stopped, corrected himself. "What about everything John has done for us? For you? He's been working his ass off to give us a future, and you want to throw yours away." Michael's eyes darkened. "College isn't the only way to have a future." John held up a hand before Sam could retort. "Michael, I need you to be straight with me. What's going on?" Michael exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've been saving up, working extra hours at the hardware store, mowing lawns on weekends. I want to start my own business." John frowned. "Business?" "Landscaping," Michael said firmly. "I've been studying everything I can. There's a huge demand in this town. I already have a plan." Sam rolled his eyes. "That's your big plan? Mowing lawns?" Michael turned on him. "It's my choice. Not everyone wants to sit in school for the next 8 years." Eli, still silent, whispered, "Please don't fight." John rubbed his temples. "Michael, I don't care if you go to college or not. What I do care about is whether or not you have a solid plan. You're not going to just jump into this without thinking it through." Michael's anger deflated slightly. "I do have a plan. I've already talked to some suppliers, looked at equipment costs. I just need a little help getting started." John nodded slowly. "All right. Then show me your business plan. If it's solid, we'll talk." Sam still looked frustrated, but he kept his mouth shut. Michael, though still tense, gave a sharp nod. The fight wasn't over. But at least for now, the storm had settled. The hardest question. A week later, John sat in the kitchen, staring at a single sheet of paper. It was a drawing. Eli's, a picture of their family: John, Michael, Sam, and Eli. They were standing in front of the house, their hands joined. But there was something different about this one. The colors. Half of the drawing was shaded in bright, warm hues. The other half was darker, more muted. A story of 2 lives. Eli walked in quietly, noticing John looking at the drawing. "Do you like it?" John nodded, tapping the edge of the paper. "Yeah, bud. It's powerful." Eli hesitated, then sat down across from him. "I've been thinking a lot," he murmured. John leaned forward. "About what?" Eli's small hands twisted together. "Do you think Mom and Dad would be okay with this? With us? With you being our dad?" John felt his heart twist. He had wondered the same thing 1,000 times. Would Mark and Sarah approve of the way he was raising their boys? Had he done enough? Was he enough? He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I think they'd be proud of you, Eli. Of all of you." Eli chewed his lip. "Do you think they'd be proud of you?" John swallowed hard. "I hope so." Eli looked at him for a long moment, then slid his small hand into John's. "I think they would." And just like that, another piece of the past found its place in the present. The unthinkable. Winter dragged on. But the town never stopped needing its firefighters. It happened late one night. John had just settled into bed when the alarm came through. A house fire. Severe. Possible people trapped inside. He moved on instinct, throwing on his gear and rushing to the station. Within minutes, the truck was roaring down the icy streets, sirens piercing the cold. The house was already an inferno when they arrived. Neighbors stood in the snow, watching helplessly as flames consumed the home. John jumped out of the truck, adrenaline surging through him. He was already running toward the house when someone shouted, "There's still a kid inside." John didn't hesitate. The flames were roaring, the heat pressing in on him from all sides. The ceiling groaned, threatening collapse. He pushed forward, sweeping the smoke-filled room with his flashlight. Then he saw him. A little boy, no older than Eli, curled up in the corner, coughing violently. John moved fast. Scooping the boy into his arms, he turned back toward the door. Just as the ceiling gave way, a beam crashed down, blocking his path. The fire surged, swallowing the exit in flames. John's mind raced. There had to be another way out. His oxygen was running low. The boy's breaths were coming in short, ragged gasps. He had seconds to decide. Summoning every ounce of strength, John turned, searching for another path. There. A window. It was their only chance. With a deep breath, John tightened his grip on the child and sprinted toward it. The heat was unbearable. His vision blurred. The flames roared at his back. And then, with one final burst of strength, he leaped. Glass shattered. Cold air slammed into him as he hit the ground, shielding the boy with his body. Then everything went black. The aftermath. John woke up in a hospital bed, the rhythmic beep of monitors filling the silence. His body ached. His lungs burned. But he was alive. And so was the boy. As his vision cleared, he saw them, Michael, Sam, and Eli, standing at his bedside, their faces pale, their eyes red-rimmed. Eli was the first to speak, his voice small. "You scared us." John tried to smile. "Didn't mean to." Michael exhaled sharply. "You almost died." John's eyes softened. "I had to do it. That boy needed someone." Sam swallowed. "So did we." The words hung heavy in the air. John reached out, taking their hands. "I'm not going anywhere." And as they held onto him, he knew, no matter what storms came next, they would always find their way back to each other. The cost of sacrifice. The beeping of the hospital monitors was steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. John Carter stared at the ceiling, his body aching with every breath. His skin was raw from minor burns, his ribs felt like they'd been put through a meat grinder, and his head pounded from the aftereffects of smoke inhalation. But he was alive. And so was the little boy he'd carried out of that burning house. He should have felt relief. He should have felt grateful. Instead, he felt guilt. Because as soon as he opened his eyes in that hospital room, the first thing he saw wasn't a doctor or a nurse. It was Michael. His oldest boy stood stiffly by the window, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he was holding back a storm of emotions. Sam sat in a chair, hunched forward, staring at the floor like he couldn't bring himself to look at John. And Eli, sweet, sensitive Eli, sat curled in the corner of the room, his small fingers clutched around his sketchbook like it was the only thing keeping him together. John swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "Hey, guys." His voice came out rough, like gravel scraping against steel. Eli's head snapped up. His lower lip trembled, but he didn't say a word. Michael turned, his face unreadable. His voice, however, was not. "What the hell were you thinking?" John blinked. Michael's words weren't angry. They were furious. "I was doing my job," John answered slowly. Michael let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Your job? Dad, you almost died." Sam finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "You scared us." John exhaled. "I had to do it. That kid. That kid had parents. Michael cut him off. That kid had a family. And you? His voice cracked. He turned away, his fists clenched. John's heart twisted. It hit him then. This wasn't just about the fire. This was about Mark. About how they'd already lost one father. And how, for a terrifying moment, his boys thought they were about to lose another. John pushed himself up despite the pain, forcing himself to sit upright. Michael. His son didn't turn. Sam, Eli. His voice softened. Come here. Eli was the first to move. He rushed forward, throwing his arms around John's waist, burying his face into his hospital gown. Sam hesitated before stepping closer. Michael stayed where he was. I know it was scary, John said gently, one arm wrapped around Eli, while his other hand rested on Sam's shoulder. But this is who I am. I couldn't just let that kid die. Michael finally turned back, his expression raw. And what about us? John's breath caught. What happens if next time you don't make it? Michael's voice wavered. Do you ever think about that? Do you ever think about what it would do to us? John looked at his oldest son, the one who had taken on so much responsibility after losing his parents, the one who had tried so hard to be strong for his brothers. And in that moment, he realized, Michael had never allowed himself to grieve. He had spent the past year making sure Eli and Sam were okay, making sure John was okay. But he had never once let himself break. John held out a hand. Come here, son. Michael hesitated. Then, finally, he crossed the room. And when he did, John pulled him into a hug. Michael stiffened at first, but then the dam broke. His shoulders shook, his fingers clenched into the fabric of John's hospital gown. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself fall apart. John held him, held all of them, and made another silent promise. He wasn't going anywhere. A hard decision. John was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. The town had heard about what happened, about how he'd risked his life to save another child. People called him a hero. But all John could think about was the way Michael had looked at him in that hospital room. When they got home, things were different. Michael withdrew, spending more time at the hardware store and avoiding family dinners. Sam buried himself in schoolwork, spending extra hours at the library, refusing to talk about what had happened. Eli was the only one who stuck close. He hovered near John constantly, watching him like he expected him to collapse at any moment. John knew he had to do something. One evening after dinner, he gathered them in the living room. I need to talk to you guys. Michael didn't look up from his phone. Sam kept his arms crossed. Eli sat with his sketchbook, his pencil moving nervously. John took a deep breath. I'm retiring. Silence. Michael's head snapped up. What? John nodded. I put in my papers today. The department's throwing me a retirement party next month. Sam's eyes narrowed. But you love being a firefighter. John exhaled. I love you more. Eli's pencil froze. Michael sat back, his expression unreadable. You're really doing this? John nodded. It's time. I've done my part. And I'm not risking putting you through that kind of fear again. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Michael whispered, Thank you. And just like that, the weight on his son's shoulders finally lifted. A new chapter. John's retirement was the talk of the town. The fire station threw a party, cake, speeches, stories about his years of service. His old colleagues hugged him, clapped him on the back, and told him how much they would miss him. The mayor even gave a speech, calling him a hero. But the only thing that mattered to John was the 3 boys sitting in the front row, watching him with something that looked an awful lot like peace. Later that night, back at home, Michael pulled John aside. I know I was angry before, he admitted, but I didn't want to lose you. John squeezed his shoulder. You're never losing me, kid. Michael hesitated. So what now? What's next for you? John smiled. I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I get to figure it out. Michael grinned. Well, Whatever it is, I think you've earned it. John ruffled his hair, laughing when Michael swatted his hand away. For the first time in years, John Carter wasn't running into burning buildings. But as he looked at his sons, his family, he realized something. He had already built something worth protecting. And he wasn't going anywhere. Rising from the ashes, retirement didn't come easy for John Carter. For 15 years, his life had been dictated by the unpredictable call of duty. The blaring alarm in the middle of the night, the adrenaline rush of running into a burning building, the brotherhood of the fire station. Those things had defined him. Now, for the first time in his life, there was silence. No alarms, no emergencies, just quiet. And for a man like John, that silence felt suffocating. The struggle of letting go. At first, he tried to keep busy. He fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing. He organized the garage, then reorganized it again. He went to the grocery store every morning, even when they didn't need anything. Michael noticed first. "You okay, Dad?" John glanced up from where he was polishing the already spotless kitchen table. "Yeah." "Why?" Michael folded his arms. "Because that's the third time you've cleaned that table today." John scowled. "I like it clean." Michael smirked. "You miss it, don't you?" John exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face. "It's weird. I spent years running into fires, and now I don't know what to do with myself." Michael thought for a moment. "Well, maybe it's time to start something new." John raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Michael grinned. "That's for you to figure out." Eli's gallery opening. If there was one thing keeping John grounded, it was Eli's art. Ever since that first painting of their home, Eli had thrown himself into his work. His talent had blossomed, his technique sharpened. And now, for the first time, he had been invited to display his work at the town's biggest art gallery. John had never been more proud. The night of the gallery opening. The whole family dressed up. John wore a suit, a rare occasion. Michael and Sam teased him about it the whole way there. When they arrived, the gallery was packed. Eli's work was displayed in the front, his vibrant paintings drawing people in. John stood back, watching as Eli spoke with critics, collectors, and admirers. "You look like a proud dad," someone said beside him. John turned and found himself face to face with an older man, Mr. Wells, the gallery owner. "I am," John admitted. Mr. Wells smiled. "You should be. He's got a gift, and it's clear he comes from a family that supports him." John felt warmth spread through his chest. That night, as Eli sold his first painting, John realized something. He might have retired from firefighting, but he was still building something important. A legacy. Michael's first business deal. While Eli's career was taking off, Michael was making moves of his own. His landscaping business had started small, just mowing lawns, trimming hedges. But as the months passed, he grew his client base. He studied business strategies, saved every penny he earned, and eventually invested in professional equipment. One afternoon, Michael burst into the house, his face lit up with excitement. "Dad, you won't believe this." John looked up from the newspaper. "What's up?" Michael grinned. "The mayor's office just called. They want me to bid for a contract to landscape the entire town square." John's eyebrows shot up. "That's huge." Michael nodded eagerly. "I know. It's my chance to make this a real business, not just a side job." John stood, placing a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "You've earned this." Michael swallowed hard. "Think I can do it?" John smiled. "I know you can." Michael won the bid. And just like that, his dream became a reality. Sam's acceptance letter. While Michael was building his business and Eli was painting his future, Sam had been quietly working toward his own dream. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Sam cleared his throat. "I got something in the mail today." John glanced up. "Yeah. What is it?" Sam slid an envelope across the table. John picked it up, his heart pounding as he read the words at the top. Johns Hopkins University, School of Medicine. His eyes widened. Sam. Sam exhaled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I got in. Silence filled the room. Then Michael whooped, clapping Sam on the back. Hell yeah, man. Eli grinned. I knew you would. John looked at his son, pride swelling in his chest. You did it, he said softly. Sam met his gaze. I couldn't have done it without you. John's throat tightened. For years, he had worried about whether he was doing enough for these boys, whether he had given them the future they deserved. And now, sitting at that table, looking at the young men they had become, he realized he had done something right. A surprise for John. A few weeks later, John came home to find all three of his sons standing in the living room, grinning like they were up to something. What's going on? He asked wearily. Michael held up a blindfold. Put this on. John frowned. Why? Eli laughed. Just trust us. With a sigh, John let them blindfold him. They led him outside, their hands guiding him carefully down the steps. When they finally stopped, Michael pulled off the blindfold. John blinked. And then his breath caught. Before him stood an old fire truck. But not just any fire truck. It was Engine 17. His first truck. The one he had trained on. The one he had driven for years. Restored. Polished. Brought back to life. John turned to his sons, stunned. How? Michael grinned. It was Eli's idea. Eli blushed. I wanted to do something special. Sam nodded. We found it in an old lot. Spent months fixing it up. John ran a hand over the gleaming red paint, emotion tightening his chest. This is incredible. Michael handed him a small plaque. John read the inscription aloud, his voice thick. For John Carter, the man who saved lives, built a family, and taught us the true meaning of strength. John swallowed hard. For years, he had thought his legacy was in firefighting. But looking at his sons, standing proudly beside him, he realized his real legacy was them, and nothing could ever take that away. A legacy that lives on. The years had passed in the blink of an eye. John Carter sat on the porch of his home, rocking gently in an old wooden chair, watching the late afternoon sun cast golden light over the town he had spent his entire life serving. The house, once quiet and lonely, had grown into something far greater, a home filled with love, laughter, and memories. His sons had grown into remarkable men, each carving his own path, yet never straying far from the foundation they had built together. John exhaled deeply, a contented smile touching his lips. For so long, he had wondered if he had done enough. But looking at the life they had built, he knew the answer. He had given them everything. And in return, they had given him something he never thought he'd have again, a family that would last for generations to come. Michael's success. Michael stood in the middle of Thompson Green Space's main headquarters, surrounded by employees who had once been just like him, young, ambitious, and searching for a way forward. His business had started with nothing but an idea and a determination to prove himself. Now, it was the leading landscaping and urban development company in the region, responsible for redesigning parks, revitalizing neglected spaces, and creating sustainable greenery projects throughout the city. Michael leaned against his desk, flipping through the blueprints for their latest project, a memorial park dedicated to first responders. He smiled to himself. His dad had spent his life protecting people. Now Michael was making sure the places people lived in were just as safe, beautiful, and full of life. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Sarah, peeked in. "Your dad's here." Michael grinned. "Send him in." John stepped inside, his silver hair shining under the office lights. He looked around, impressed. "Every time I see this place, it's bigger." Michael shrugged. "Gotta keep growing." John chuckled, settling into a chair. "So, tell me about this memorial park." Michael slid the blueprints across the desk. It's gonna be right in the center of town. A place for people to remember the ones who put everything on the line. He hesitated before adding, I want to name it after you. John's eyes widened. Michael, you deserve it. John swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Son, I don't need my name on a park. Michael smiled. Yeah, well, I do. John didn't argue. Because in that moment, he realized, Michael had been listening all those years. He had learned the lessons John had spent his life teaching. And now he was passing them on. Sam's calling. Sam stood outside the hospital, staring up at the towering structure that had once been just a place of work, but had now become something far greater, a place of healing, a place where he had made his mark on the world. He had done it. He had become a doctor. Not just any doctor, one of the best cardiologists in the state. He had spent years studying, working grueling shifts, pushing himself past exhaustion to master his craft. Now he was at the forefront of innovative cardiac treatments, saving lives just like his father once had in a different way. His phone buzzed in his pocket. When he pulled it out, he saw a message from his dad. John Carter. Proud of you, son. Hope you're getting some sleep. Sam chuckled to himself before replying. Sam Carter. Define sleep. Shaking his head, he pocketed his phone and walked inside, ready for another long shift. Because even though he worked in a hospital, saving people every day, he never forgot the real reason he had chosen this path. His father had taught him that strength wasn't just about running into fires. It was about standing in the face of fear and choosing to help, no matter the cost. And Sam intended to do that for the rest of his life. Eli's exhibition. Eli stood in the middle of an art gallery, surrounded by some of the most influential artists, collectors, and critics in the industry. He had come a long way from painting at the kitchen table. His work had been featured in major exhibits, his name spoken with respect in the art world. But no matter how far he had come, one thing had never changed: his inspiration, his family. His latest series, Roots of Fire, was his most personal yet. Each piece depicted a different moment from their lives. Michael mowing the lawn as a teenager, Sam studying late at night, their father standing in his firefighter uniform, the three of them as children holding hands in front of their first home. One painting stood at the center of the exhibit, a massive tree, its roots intertwined, one half representing their past, the other representing their present, all of it connected. A journalist approached Eli with a microphone. Your work carries such deep emotion. What's the story behind this piece? Eli smiled, glancing toward the entrance where John Carter had just walked in, looking around the gallery with awe. It's about family, Eli answered simply. About how love grows, even in unexpected places. John approached, resting a hand on Eli's shoulder. It's incredible, son. Eli beamed. So are you. John pulled him into a side hug, looking around at the gallery, at the people admiring his son's work. He had once worried about whether he could give these boys the life they deserved. Now he saw the truth. They had built it together. A new generation. John's 60th birthday arrived quietly, without fanfare. That was until his sons showed up. One by one, they arrived at the house, their own children in tow. Michael had 3 kids now. Emma, Caleb, and little Mark, named after his grandfather. Sam's twins, Nathan and Maya, were just as curious and bright as their father. Eli's daughter, Sophia, clung to his leg, her tiny fingers covered in paint. John sat back in his chair, watching them all, his heart full. Michael raised a glass. To Dad. Sam nodded. To the man who raised us. Eli grinned. To the firefighter who gave us a home. John looked around, his eyes misty. He had spent a lifetime running into fires, saving people from disaster. But his greatest achievement wasn't found in the smoldering remains of buildings. It was found in the people sitting before him. His sons, his grandkids, his legacy. And as they laughed, shared stories, and celebrated a life well lived, John Carter leaned back, closed his eyes, and smiled. Because in the end, he had saved more than lives. He had built a family. And that was the greatest rescue of all.